So our thesis is that within the next 5 to 10 years, we will reach hyperbitcoinization just because everything else is blowing up and failing. Asia is an interesting beast. You have certain countries that are hostile. So China is somewhat hostile, but that seems to be changing because now Hong Kong is embracing Bitcoin and unfortunately crypto. So that seems to be a change. I don't think that they can do that sort of welcome in China itself, but Hong Kong is a part of China now. Them opening up means that there is a signal from Beijing that it's okay to do so. And I think that's very interesting because it's a novel way for China to adopt Bitcoin because people in China can go to Hong Kong, open up accounts, and potentially access this.
Bing bong. I am live with another edition of the State of Bitcoin podcast, where I've got a very special guest in the waiting room, Samson Mow, who you guys have all heard of. But we're going to go over essentially Bitcoin nation state adoption, the effects of the SEC, ETF filings, views on Bitcoin adoption by region, and a lot more great topics. Now, enough of me blabbing. Let's bring Samson up. Samson, how you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks, Brandon, for having me on.
All right. So, Samson, you've been everywhere. You're on a lot of panels, a lot of talking about, various topics, mostly Bitcoin adoption these days, it seems, at a lot of conferences. But let's bring it back. So kind of how did you get involved into the Bitcoin space? And how did you get to where you're at today?
So I guess my official foray into Bitcoin is as the COO of BTC China. I joined them first as an advisor, and then I moved into the COO role. So my background is running a cryptocurrency exchange and mining pool. And yeah, I think that was really what got me deeper into Bitcoin. I read about Bitcoin before, but that was really the starting point of actually doing something in the space.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And then, now it seems like you're kind of all over the place, and you're meeting with great politicians and everything like that. You're even rocking out at Satoshi Nakamoto. So, I saw you up there playing a little bit of the bass guitar. So, what was that like? What's kind of the experience that you've been when you go to these conferences and kind of, interact with a bunch of different Bitcoiners all over the place?
I think that was Miami, right? So Knut
Yeah,
was on bass. I was on guitar, and Pleb Music was on guitar. But that was fun. It was fun. Lightning Ventures put that on, and it's always fun.
Yeah, it's always fun stuff. So, but you did start off at Blockstream, if I'm correct. So we talked about a little bit about this on pre-show, but I kind of want to dive into Liquid first before we kind of get into nation state adoption and other things like that. So, you guys kind of put out Liquid. I don't even know when, but I feel like it was a little bit before, the Lightning Network kind of gained popularity. So, in your eyes, well, one, can you explain kind of what Liquid is and like the purpose of it? And then I'll ask a follow-up.
Sure. So Liquid is a Bitcoin sidechain. It's a federated sidechain, and it has a lot of interesting properties. So because it is not done on the base layer, we can tweak the variables of Bitcoin in some ways. So there are faster block times in Liquid. We also have confidential transactions, and you can issue assets in Liquid too. So if you think of Bitcoin, it's just one asset. It's BTC. But Liquid has a flag for other asset types. So you can have Liquid USDT or Tether. You can have a Canadian dollar stablecoin from Bull Bitcoin. You can have even a game currency like the INF token from Infinite Fleet. But it's just a blockchain that can have multiple types of assets. And because of the property of confidential transactions, as people transact on the Liquid network, you can't really tell what they're sending. So a transaction could be Bitcoin or Liquid Bitcoin, or it could be Tether, or it could be INF, but there's no way to see that. So it is a federation, so there's an element of trust there. You have to trust that the federation maintains the operations, but they are effectively like a common carrier. Because of confidential transactions, they can't really see what's going on in the network, and they can't censor any transactions either. So it's a very interesting tech, and I think people are starting to pay more attention to it because the recent fee spike on main chain Bitcoin showed that Lightning can be brittle. So you'll have forced channel closes, or it'll be very prohibitive to open a channel or rebalance an existing Lightning channel. So it goes to show that Blockstream had a lot of foresight in building these two technologies. So Lightning development first really began at Blockstream in 2015, and Liquid probably the genesis of that was even earlier, but I think early development started on that in 2014. So you can see both of these technologies kind of work in tandem, and both of them were started at Blockstream. So Adam Back and everyone there has a lot of foresight into what is needed to bring Bitcoin to a planetary level of transaction volume.
So then why do you feel that, I mean, like you said, because the fee is kind of going up, and people are getting a little bit worried about that when it comes to, things on, main chain transactions, it seems like layer twos are kind of the new buzz, right? I mean, it seems like everybody's kind of building on Lightning, but there hasn't been really a lot of talk on building on Liquid, or kind of expanding the use case of Liquid, or even using it back and forth, it seems. Or at least maybe I'm just ignorant and I'm missing a lot of it. So why do you think that, maybe there's been more of an explosion when it comes to Lightning development, opposed to just that Liquid, the Liquid development?
Well, I think there's a few factors. So for Liquid, the original use case was inter-exchange settlement. So the backbone of the Federation are big cryptocurrency exchanges like Bitfinex, BitMEX, and others. But the main original use case that we were pushing was moving Bitcoin quickly from exchange to exchange, and then stablecoins from exchange to exchange. So Tether is issued there too. But it's a way for you to take advantage of arbitrage opportunities, or not have to deal with block times, because Liquid has 1 minute blocks. So you're certain that within 2 minutes, you'll have full settlement finality, moving coins from one exchange to another. So you can shore up a position if you're margin called, or you can execute a trade very quickly with that finality. So given that Liquid was mainly used by traders initially, it has a different adoption curve and an audience, right? Lightning was more for microtransactions, paying for your coffee, or paying for small things, or tipping. So that gains a bigger user base more immediately, and it grew a lot faster too. But I think the amount of Bitcoin pegged into Lightning that is publicly known now is about 5,600 coins, and Liquid I think is upwards of 3,000. So they're both growing, and I think we're seeing a lot more transactions on Liquid these days, simply because people are starting to understand that you need another layer, not just Lightning, because Lightning can slow down when the main chain is clogged, right? So if you need to rebalance a channel, you can't really do that with Bitcoin main chain if the main chain itself is clogged. So you need that intermediary, which is Liquid.
So it seems like, with the growing aspect of the Lightning Network, essentially like Liquid can almost grow in tandem and kind of help the growth of the Lightning Network. Am I kind of understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think there are definitely two technologies that support one another. The other dimension, I think, too, that factors into Liquid's slower growth is that Liquid, like Bitcoin, is not some tech that people can hack on easily. It is meant to be core infrastructure, and you need to have Bitcoin experience to build on top of Liquid, at least initially. It's getting a bit easier now with things like Miniscript coming into the spotlight, and that makes it a lot easier to do things with Liquid and with Bitcoin. But back in the day, like in 2015 and onwards, you have to be basically a Bitcoin core developer to do much on Liquid at that time. Whereas with Lightning, it's more akin to the Ethereums and other things like that. You can build on JavaScript and whatnot, or Go, and it's more easy to hack on because it's not a base protocol that is really hard to change. So I think that factors into developer adoption, but there are a lot of companies building on Liquid. Volcano Ventures, they're behind Fuji USD, or Fuji Money. That's a Bitcoin-backed stablecoin. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting. There's TDEX as well, and that's a decentralized exchange that's built on Liquid. You have SideSwap as well. There's a lot of companies. Also, Jan3, my company, we're building on Liquid as well, trying to create a Bitcoin wallet that is native Bitcoin layer 2 and for USDT on Liquid. So there's actually a lot of people building on Liquid, but it's not as big as Lightning, I think, because it's just easier to build on Lightning.
I got you, and that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, I'm gonna look for more development on Liquid now that you're bringing it up, because it definitely seems like, one can help the other, and like there is a need for more, I guess, Liquid development. It's just maybe not as, I guess as mainstream, right? I mean, we're not seeing like Liquid developers or like Liquid developer meetups, like that kind of stuff, right? It seems like Lightning and that is kind of, I guess, almost a new wave in a sense. But I mean, it definitely seems like there could be a way. But you mentioned something about there is some aspect of trust. So can you dive a little bit deeper into that as to what you mean with like the aspect of trust and, where, I guess things could potentially go wrong in this scenario?
Right. So Liquid is a federation, similar to Fedi, but the difference is the Liquid Federation is a fixed number of members, and the functionaries are a subset of those. And the functionaries are the people that are operating the functionary box, or the miner of the Liquid network, if you will. But that's really a black box. They can't censor or modify transactions or do anything. They're just operating this box in their data centers. But because they are exchanges and Bitcoin companies, it's a lot more robust than, say, a Fedimint federation, because they're going to be up 100% of the time. Whereas with Fedi, you might get a few of your friends. Maybe someone is running something in a Fedi node in a data center, but maybe the other guys are just running something in their basement. So you don't really know exactly how much uptime and reliability you have. And you also have the risk that they might disappear. Like, you might lose your friends one day and then that federation is gone. There's always that possibility, whereas Liquid is a federation of businesses and companies, so they have more resilience in that dimension. But the trust is really that they don't collude. The federation doesn't collude to attack the peg. So they would need a majority, I think 15 of them, to attack the peg in order to steal the coins that are pegged in. But even then, there is the concept of the peg out authorization key system. So you have to be a Liquid member to pull Bitcoin out of the federation. And as a user of Liquid, what you do is you peg out through one of the other members of the federation. But it's a security measure, because I think you've seen time and time again in the news that a lot of DeFi protocols and bridges always get attacked, and the peg is a weak point there, right, where they're bridging to some other chain or some other asset, and that just gets drained, and the thing collapses. But because Liquid, I think, foresaw the risk there is that system of peg out authorization. So you can only peg out to an existing member. And this is a whitelist, so you can't just come in as an external attacker and drain the network. You'd have to join the federation and get the key, but then, of course, then you know who you are, and there is a procedure to join the federation. So in a way, it protects it from bad actors and protects the security of the network.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown. I really appreciate you taking a dive into that. But yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like there was a lot of foresight in it. So there is some level of trust. But as you kind of lined out, it seems like a lot of things have to go one way in order for that trust to, I guess, be broken in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Which is great in a sense for the user experience and everything like that as well. But I want to start taking a dive into nation state adoption, right? I mean, I kind of alluded to it at the beginning of the talk. You were with a member of the Indonesian government at a talk for Bitcoin Miami this year. You've kind of, you seem to get into a lot of rooms where, government officials are speaking and things like that. So as you see, Bitcoin nation state adoption kind of, I guess, running through, obviously it's like kind of a slow process, but I'll give you the floor here. Just give you, if you want to give like a general overview as to, what you're kind of hearing in these rooms and like kind of the viewpoint when it comes to Bitcoin and nation state adoption.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Indonesia is a very interesting one. I think you're referring to Governor Ridwan Kamil. He's the governor of West Java in Indonesia. And from what I'm hearing, he's likely going to be either the next vice president or president of Indonesia. So these are very interesting times. And as you said, we as in Jan 3, we get invited to meet with heads of state and government officials all around the world. So we do get to have our shot at orange pilling them. It will take some time, I think. oftentimes people think it's going to be very fast. You'll have another El Salvador, snap your fingers, and they'll do a Bitcoin law, and we're done. But I think El Salvador is a bit of an outlier because the president was a Bitcoiner before he became president. So you have that massive advantage in understanding and knowledge of Bitcoin. Whereas for a lot of other heads of state, you have to take them through the process from zero at some points, or even worse, because they have a misformed opinion about Bitcoin in some way. So it's a lot of work and a lot of education, I would say. But overall, the sentiment I'm seeing is there's a massive amount of interest from governments for finding a way to integrate a Bitcoin strategy into their country and their economy. And we try to speed that up by helping them further understand how to use Bitcoin. So one of the big advantages we have is that Bitcoin can transform energy into money. And a lot of countries that are in the global south or developing still have actually a lot of energy, but they might be stranded. In the case of Indonesia, they have a massive amount of geothermal potential. I think there's the second highest in the world. They have a massive amount of hydropower and other renewables too. But they can't really do anything with that because you can't put it into a barrel and ship it to the US or Canada. You have to consume it. But with the advent of Bitcoin, you can now consume it, turn it into Bitcoin, and sell the Bitcoin. So what I like to do is tell them, you don't need to keep Bitcoin if you don't want to. I think it'd be a mistake not to, but you could just mine the Bitcoin, sell it all, and build your roads, airports, bridges, whatever, hospitals. And I think that gets them thinking about the potential for Bitcoin to be incredibly transformative to their economy. And I think more and more politicians are starting to understand that, especially because Bitcoin is becoming a hotter and hotter topic. Like you've seen at Miami, RFK was speaking about it, and he delivered an excellent speech, and he seems to have a very deep understanding. But more and more politicians around the world are starting to talk about Bitcoin as part of their campaign platforms.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be the case, right? I mean, we had like 3 different political candidates, RFK obviously being our presidential candidates in the United States, RFK being the biggest name, but Vivek as well, and then I believe an independent candidate, and the name's escaping me right now, so I apologize. But, it definitely seems like it's going to be something that's not only like, on the ballot globally, but it may be, politicians in the United States as well. But, what I think is interesting is you brought up like mining and the energy aspect of things as to, kind of the reason that where the light bulb kind of goes off for these politicians. Is that where you kind of, I guess, see more of the selling point opposed to maybe some of the hard money principles? Because, as kind of like an outsider looking in, it seems like a lot of these countries that are, dealing with their fiat currencies suffering massive amounts of inflation. You think, Argentina, Turkey, some of these other like countries that you've seen, the devaluation of their currency just, plummet in recent months. That would be kind of the selling point, but you're kind of saying otherwise. Is that kind of I guess aligning with I guess what I'm lining out here? What's up, everybody? We're taking a quick commercial break to bring you a new sponsor, the Bitcoin Advisor. Are you thinking, how can I guarantee the security of your Bitcoin? How can I shield my Bitcoin assets from an unexpected loss? What happens to my Bitcoin assets after I'm gone? How can I educate my family about these investments? And can I invest my retirement funds all into Bitcoin? Well, the Bitcoin Advisor can help you out. You can set up an appointment with me, Brandon from Green Candle, at the link below, thebitcoinadvisor.com/green candle, and book an appointment and I can help you out and we can get started today. All right, now back to the episode.
So I would say money is easier to understand immediately versus the concept of hard money. You need to go down the rabbit hole a bit, and you have to have a deeper understanding of the fundamentals of money before you appreciate hard money. Whereas money on the table that you're just passing up because you're not taking it is a much more easily digestible concept, and it helps to align incentives far more quickly than taking them through the understanding. I think one will lead to the other. It's sort of like the joke that we say, where we came in for the gains and we stayed for the sound money and the hope, right? But if you get them mining Bitcoin just to get Bitcoin, sell it, and do other things, they'll eventually start to understand the other properties of Bitcoin. But I just see it as a far easier onboarding mechanism than taking them through. But of course, we will go there. It's just you have to prioritize your pitch, right? Oftentimes, you have 30 minutes or an hour, and you have to cram as much orange pilling into that session, but at a digestible rate, where you're not, overwhelming them with details and complexity. So actually, we don't even talk about the technology. We only talk about money usually. We don't talk about the blockchain and transactions and layer twos or anything like that. We keep it very digestible, very high level, and very much focused on those incentives for them to tap into Bitcoin.
Yeah, and so like, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But do you ever have like, after you have this 30 minutes to an hour with a politician or, somebody kind of in that room or in that realm, do you ever have them like, I guess, follow up, after the fact, maybe asking for a little bit deeper questions, or do they just kind of, they get the energy aspect of things and they see like, okay, that's where their mind starts turning energy into, basically money in a sense, and that can help fund, development as you kind of lined out earlier. Or do they, I mean, it seems like everything in politics moves kind of slow. So maybe, you meet with a politician, then like 6 months later, they reach back out. But do you see them any desire to kind of, I guess, dig a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I think they do reach back out sometimes, but oftentimes it's us trying to follow up again. But it's really up to us to move the needle, because if you're a head of state and you're the president, you have a lot of other things to deal with at any given time. Like Bitcoin and the economy is one of those things, but they might need to deal with civil unrest, or they might need to deal with foreign affairs, or just crime. Like in the case of El Salvador, they spend a lot of effort fighting the gangs, right? So you just have to understand that for us, Bitcoin is 100% of our time, but for them, Bitcoin might be potentially 10%, even if they are fully orange pilled. So you have to take a low tide preference to nation state Bitcoin adoption too. It's going to happen, and it's up to us to push it along and move it forward.
Yeah, and that's a great way to put it. I mean, you lined out the low time preference as well, but in the short term, right? I mean, you are kind of speaking and meeting with a lot of these because of Jan 3 and the great work that you guys are doing there. But in the short term, there is a little bit of I guess maybe FUD around Bitcoin and crypto to a greater extent with the SEC, right? It seems like the SEC is coming at a lot of these crypto casinos, so to speak. They're going after Coinbase and like potentially some of these others, Binance, obviously, and then you've seen the FTX debacle and all these other companies kind of fall by the wayside. So in a sense, what are your is this FUD ever being brought up? Is this the SEC regulations ever being a talking point, or something that really deters a politician or somebody kind of in power away from Bitcoin and even having the conversation?
I don't know if it really deters, but we often see a lot of conflation between Bitcoin and crypto, which we nip in the bud and we tell them, Bitcoin is Bitcoin, crypto is crypto. It's very different. But that's probably the bigger hurdle. I think the SEC crackdown on crypto casinos is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you want to do it, go ahead, but there are repercussions, right? You can't just list unregistered securities, and a lot of these crypto projects are unregistered securities, and they're unregisterable as well. So it's bringing some degree of clarity to the market that Bitcoin is a commodity, it's money, it's decentralized, it's immutable, but everything else, they can go after them. They can say this is a security, and it's obviously a security. If you can't see that, then you're just in denial. But these things are companies, even if they say they're a Swiss foundation. They're obviously managing a project for making money and for attracting investment. Otherwise, they wouldn't do all the things they do. So I think the SEC actions are providing a certain degree of clarity, and that is a good thing, because as countries look towards Bitcoin adoption, that sort of solidifies and amplifies our messaging that Bitcoin is Bitcoin, everything else is a security. And you can be welcoming of securities if you want. So you can have digital securities laws that would allow these projects to register as a security. So El Salvador, ahead of doing their Volcano Bonds, if they do that, they put out the digital securities law, and that would allow projects in the crypto space to register and just say, I'm a security, I'm raising capital, and formalize that process instead of trying to live in that gray area and say you're decentralized and not a security.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And you brought it up, so let's dive into it a little bit as well. The volcano bonds, right? I mean, you are the architect of the volcano bonds. So when it comes to adoption, and you brought up mining and other things like that as well. Are people kind of looking at what El Salvador is doing? Like, are other countries kind of keeping a closer eye as to the volcano bonds, like kind of how things were going with like the Chivo wallet and other things like that, and maybe even like the tourism and kind of the other side effects that were positive that kind of came from the adoption of Bitcoin?
Right. So I don't know too much about what's happening with the volcano bonds right now. I helped design a Bitcoin bond structure, which I think is different than a volcano bond. It's a superstructure of revenue generating activity combined with some Bitcoin holdings. And the volcano bond is a subset of that, where you're doing mining with geothermal power. But I saw an article in Forbes that said the new project Volcano Energy fulfills President Bukele's vision of the volcano bond. So I'm not really sure how to interpret that, but maybe that is a replacement, or it's a first step and they will do it later. But what we are seeing is there are other countries interested in the concept of a Bitcoin bond. So that superstructure of Bitcoin holdings plus a revenue generating activity. So in the case of Costa Rica, they are interested to do something potentially like a hydro bond, tapping into their hydropower. Also, Ecuador as well. We've been talking to some government people there, and they're interested in doing it based on hydropower as well. I mean, Indonesia could do it. They could do volcano and hydro bonds because they have both. But this whole idea of creating sovereign debt backed by Bitcoin is still a very interesting thing, and there's still a lot of interest around that. We just have to move that forward and help them structure these offerings. But it is a way for countries to get out of debt, because the key here is you have dollar denominated debt, but you're backing it with something harder that will appreciate against the dollar. And that's really the only way to get out of the debt spiral, because if you just keep borrowing more money to service debt, you'll be in debt forever. So I see many countries looking at this as an opportunity to break that cycle.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it definitely seems like, that's kind of like, I guess, the viewpoint, right? I mean, like other countries are probably looking at, obviously that, like I said, the US kind of controlling the dollar, and, the interest rate hikes and other things like that, where, they're kind of almost in a sense destroying the offshore dollar market. So, do you kind of, I guess, get that sense where, because the US is, basically pulling the strings here, that other countries are, I don't know if it's getting annoyed, frustrated. I don't know, I guess the best way to put it, but, are kind of, I guess, more open to the conversation of an alternative, just because of, the US kind of having all this power and having it for some time. And, obviously since 1971, having the global reserve currency, that, maybe it's time for a change, or something along those lines.
Well, I think it is a trend, and we're seeing that emerge with the BRICS and them trying to create their own currency as well. But I've seen other heads of state speak out about finding a way out of the old systems. So we just have to reach them. I think there was a president in Africa, I forgot which country, but he was posting something saying that they need to figure a way out of debt spiral, right, and getting out of that debt slavery. So we just have to reach out and talk to them about Bitcoin, and hopefully the incentives will align themselves and they'll understand it. But I would say the world is moving towards de-dollarization. A lot of trade is now shifting to other currencies, settlement in other currencies like the Chinese yuan and potentially others. But I'd say it's going to shift, and they might settle on some interim settlement currencies. Maybe it's the Chinese yuan, maybe it's something else, but ultimately they're going to move towards Bitcoin because any fiat money is still subject to the same risks as using the US dollar. You can store your reserve currency that you accumulate in that at the central bank of the issuer, but it's an IOU note that can be cut at any given time. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can keep it yourself and custody it yourself, and nobody can prevent you from accessing and transacting in it. So everything is a mid-step towards hyper-Bitcoinization. They're all going to use Bitcoin eventually. I think one of the things that we try to do at Jan3 is smooth that transition over. So our thesis is that within the next 5 to 10 years, we will reach hyper-Bitcoinization, just because everything else is blowing up and failing. But it would be more beneficial to the people of the world, citizens of these countries, if they had parallel tracks going into that shift. Because if you have a demonetization event or hyperinflation event, and you don't have a parallel track of Bitcoin in addition to Argentinian pesos or Turkish lira, then you're going to have a mass exodus of people trying to get out of that currency. And that's going to cause a lot of chaos. And if you look at history, all of these demonetization events usually lead to a lot of human suffering and potentially death. So the best case scenario is countries start to adopt Bitcoin, and they don't need to just ditch their fiat currency. They can have both of them running in parallel. So you can have that slow transition, because as we know, getting into Bitcoin is not simple, right? You need to understand a few things. You need to understand some basic IT security, how to secure your devices. You need to understand how to back up your seed phrase and how to make a transaction. But for us, it's like breathing the air or drinking water. But for many people, they have no idea. And I think there's a learning curve still. So we want to see if we can ease that transition into a hyper-Bitcoinized world.
Yeah, and I mean, it definitely took a little bit of everybody, everybody listening. We probably have various levels of degrees of Bitcoiner, I guess, so to speak, where, when you first get in, you kind of forget like how, I guess, almost programmed you were, in a sense of like, this is just the way things are, like the fiat kind of world that we lived in, the clown world, as Bitcoin Twitter loves to put it as well. So, I mean, it takes some time to get that I guess, out of that space, in a sense. And especially, for politicians who kind of, I guess we're almost raised in their career path in that world to kind of, maybe question it or go along those lines. So I want to get into, some more of like, I guess, breaking down of the regions, right? I mean, we've seen obviously El Salvador, Central African Republic, I believe, also made Bitcoin legal tender. I haven't heard any really updates since then, but I want to hear like basically your thoughts on, by region, right? And the three regions that I really want to focus on are, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. I know obviously Asia and Africa are very huge, and Latin America is a little bit, a little bit smaller. But let's start at Latin America. Obviously, we've had El Salvador, develop or make Bitcoin legal tender. We have Argentina that's making a lot of headlines where, their currency is kind of inflated. So how do you see, I guess, the conversation going in Latin America and kind of adoption starting there? Quick commercial break to bring you some of the dopest Bitcoin merch in the game. That's Hodler's Official. That's HODLERS official.com. You can go and get yourself a black jersey like I got on right here, or a white one where you can get the Genesis pack with the 09 on the block, repping Satoshi, repping the #1 guy in Bitcoin. And you can get yourself the best merch by going to hodlersofficial.com and using promo code GREENCANDLE for 10% off your entire order. That's 2 handfuls of percentages, ladies and gentlemen. 10% off. You can use the rest of that to purchase more Bitcoin or do whatever you want with it, but I'm saving you some Skrilla Manila. So go ahead and get yourself one. I prefer the black, but if you like the white, I don't mind that either. All right, now back to the show.
Right. So the focus of Jan3 is largely on Latin America because we see it as the ripest area or region for Bitcoin adoption. And that's because of a number of factors. You have a lot of very developed political systems. You have a relatively stable system of governance and politics. You have El Salvador anchoring Bitcoin adoption, and you also have a strong need in some parts of LATAM for Bitcoin too, because Venezuela, Argentina, they're facing massive amounts of inflation at this time, and their currencies are devaluing. So if you add up all those things, then it looks very attractive. Also, you have to take into account the political turnover. So within the next 5 years, I think most countries in LATAM are going to have a new prime minister or president. So with that change comes a lot of opportunity, because they might bring in fresh blood, younger candidates that are more in tune, or they might be candidates that we're already in touch with and have contacts with. So it's hard to get in touch with sitting presidents and prime ministers, but if you meet them before, you have a higher probability of orange pilling them post fact after they're elected. So there's just a lot of opportunity in LATAM, I think, at this time. And that's really our focus. And if you look at some of the other regions in LATAM, they can adopt Bitcoin very easily. So I always bring up these two, Guatemala and Panama. They don't need a Bitcoin law, actually. They can just say, the next presidents can just say, we accept Bitcoin. So in the case of Guatemala, they have a law called divisas, which is they recognize any foreign currency and that can be used as money in the country. And of course, as I mentioned, with El Salvador anchoring Bitcoin adoption in the region, Bitcoin is a foreign currency. It's the currency of El Salvador. In the case of Panama, they have no central bank, so they can use any money they see fit in Panama. So the next president just needs to say, well, we accept Bitcoin. We're a Bitcoin country, and you're done. No legal change necessary. But the other beautiful thing about LATAM is that there's a lot of energy, and their energy infrastructure is more developed than a lot of other places in the world. So you do have excess energy available, and that leads to Bitcoin mining. Whereas in other places like Africa, they're more stressed on energy. Like I remember, I don't know if you remember, but the Central African Republic tried to do something with Bitcoin, and they tried to pass a Bitcoin law. They flip-flopped on that a few times, but there was a delegation there. My friend Seb went there and led that. But his observation was there's not a lot of energy infrastructure outside of the capital city. Most of the country doesn't have electricity, so it's not that conductive for Bitcoin mining, because Bitcoin mining is energy intensive. But yeah, like my point is, LATAM for us in our analysis is the best region to focus on at this time. But that's not to say other regions are not important. But for us to dedicate resources and energy, that's probably the best use of our time. But we do keep in contact with other regions. So if you want to move on, like we can talk more about Africa. Africa, I think the focus should be largely on grassroots adoption, because the political and governance systems are not as developed and stable. So we should just focus on encouraging more things like Bitcoin Akasi and other people trying to boot up circular economies through merchant adoption. And I think there are a lot of young people in Africa that are already familiar with Bitcoin, and they're using Bitcoin as a savings technology to avoid inflation and having to deal with the fiat currencies. So that, I think, is my take on Africa, that we should push more grassroots adoption at the bottom level.
All right, yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense as well, right? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of, I don't know if about, I guess, development kind of going on when it comes to like nation state things, but I mean, obviously there's Bitcoin Africa, that conference is going on. It seems like there's a lot of push for the education aspect of that in Africa. Obviously, there's adopting Bitcoin in El Salvador and some other conferences in LATAM as well. But it definitely seems like there's kind of the growing push, for the use of the Lightning Network and kind of the transaction, the grassroots things in Africa, at least from my perspective as an outsider looking in, where I'm just kind of floating it on the internet and seeing that.
Yeah, we forgot to talk about Asia.
Yeah, no, I was just about to transition to that. So yeah, let's dive into it. You brought it up, so let's go.
Yeah, so Asia is an interesting beast. You have certain countries that are hostile. So China is somewhat hostile, but that seems to be changing because now Hong Kong is embracing Bitcoin and unfortunately crypto. So they're trying to attract all these companies to open bank accounts, and there has been a mandate to facilitate that and expedite account opening for Bitcoin and crypto companies. So that seems to be a change. I don't think that they can do that sort of welcome in China itself, but Hong Kong is a part of China now. So them opening up means that there is a signal from Beijing that it's okay to do so. And I think that's very interesting because it's a novel way for China to adopt Bitcoin, because people in China can go to Hong Kong, open up accounts, and potentially access this. And I think Indonesia is very interesting too, because as we talked about before, if Ridwan Kamil is a VP or president in the future, he seems to have a good fundamental understanding of the basics of Bitcoin, especially on mining. That could lead to Indonesia being a big adopter of Bitcoin, and that's 270 million people. But I think the more interesting thing about Indonesia is the trajectory, because if you look at what's happened in the past, they've blocked Bitcoin from being used as a payment mechanism. And if you go back in history and look at China, that was actually the first leg of the crackdown. So at BTC China, we had an app called JustPay, and that was meant for payments. And that was the first thing that we had to turn off during the crackdowns. So we had to stop onboarding merchants and stop helping them accept Bitcoin as payments. But then if you look at the progression, it starts with cracking down on payments and then shutting down of the exchanges and then cracking down on mining. So it's progressive. And if you look at Indonesia, they've already started that with cracking down on payments, right? Recently, there's another article coming out from a government official connected to Bali saying they're going to put you in jail if you, or fine you if you pay with Bitcoin. But we'll see if they enforce that. But the next step would be cracking down on exchange and then mining. But then at this side of the spectrum, you have Ridwan saying we want mining to come in. So it's a very interesting battleground to see where it goes. And I'm hopefully it goes in the right direction. And I'm hopeful also that it goes in the right direction because there are Bitcoiners in Indonesia pushing for Bitcoin adoption. So there's a group there. They're doing a Bitcoin conference, the Indonesian Bitcoin conference in Bali. And I'll be going there in October. Jack Dorsey's going there. So hopefully we can steer things better in the right direction and encourage that Bitcoin adoption. But there are other places too that seem to have these Bitcoin movements pushing for Bitcoin adoption. So in Korea too, there's a group of Bitcoiners trying to do a Bitcoin-only conference. And historically, Korea has been very crypto and shitcoiny, right? Do Kwon came out of Korea. And I think these movements are going to help a lot with the nation-state adoption of Bitcoin, because the governments are going to have these grassroots communities and people there, keeping them honest and keeping them aligned with the Bitcoin ethos.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. I want you to dive into that a little bit more, right? I mean, we had in El Salvador Bitcoin Beach. It seems like we've had a bunch of different, kind of, I guess, Bitcoin areas where people are accepting and kind of doing that grassroots movement. Bitcoin Lake. I mean, it seems like there's more of these popping up by the day. So, how important would you say those are when it comes to Bitcoin nation state adoption? Like, are politicians actually, I guess, seeing some of these things pop up and kind of keeping a close eye, or is it kind of, depending on the situation?
I think they're very important. So I've said it a number of times before. You need both grassroots adoption and top-level adoption. The top-level adoption is removing barriers to grassroots adoption, right? So let's take Indonesia as an example. If they say you can't pay with Bitcoin, that's going to hinder that grassroots movement, right? So you have to engage with the government at some level, because we still live in countries and the government still has power. It's cool to say, we'll separate money in the state, but what do you actually do to separate that? You have to engage in some way, right? Or everyone is just using Bitcoin instantly and then they have to accept it. But for the most part, you have to have some plan in place to reach that point. So you do need that top-level adoption to facilitate adoption and remove barriers, because governments can put you in jail. But you also need that grassroots adoption. And we've seen countries like Central African Republic try to do some adoption without the grassroots support. So when Sebastian went there to Central African Republic with that delegation, he found that there is no grassroots adoption. It was a government initiative, and then they launched Sango coin after that, and then they flip-flopped on the law. I think they repealed it, put it back in place, but there's just no grassroots movement there. There's no real usage anchoring that Bitcoin adoption, so it doesn't really work. There's no one to keep them honest. So I think we have to encourage more of these movements and more of these little micro economies of Bitcoin in these regions, because they're an example that the governments can look to, go to, and learn, interact with them. And they are a proof of concept that Bitcoin can work and it can fuel an economy. So in the case of Bitcoin Jungle in Costa Rica, the reason that Bitcoin is so prevalent there is because it's hard for foreign nationals to move money into Costa Rican banks. And they're using Bitcoin to do that, to move their money in, to buy properties and pay for services and buy food and live. And that is a very powerful, poignant example of Bitcoin's utility. And it also shows that Bitcoin is a key to prosperity, because you have people coming and investing in the country through Bitcoin and powering that economy. There are 400 merchants, I believe, in Bitcoin Jungle that take Bitcoin as payment, and the population there is not that big. So it's a massive ecosystem on that scale, if you will. And I think the Costa Rican government being able to look at that and see that in their own backyard will help them further understand Bitcoin and the benefits of Bitcoin.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned like kind of the, I guess, the banking system in Costa Rica, right? I mean, it obviously that's a big use case, and the reason why it seems like we need Bitcoin, adoption in many countries. But in the United States now, we're having a lot of these big players, whether it's like BlackRock, Fidelity, kind of filing for an ETF and maybe trying to get their way into, I guess, the Bitcoin space. So before we kind of dive into like the ETFs and those filings, I want to ask you more about like the banks in other countries. If you have any, I guess, knowledge or anything like that, do you kind of foresee maybe some of the banking systems in, different countries, almost kind of similar to the choke point 2.0 theory here in the United States, where they're going to cut off, the way to either, purchase Bitcoin or try to, I guess, attack it in that sense?
Well, the banks are in a very difficult position. If you disregard Bitcoin for a moment, banking in and of itself is suffering a massive crisis, because they have more and more reporting obligations and compliance requirements that are driving up their costs. So onboarding a new customer is actually a massive risk to banks, because if there's a problem with that new customer, then they have a risk of fines and other penalties. So without Bitcoin, they're already failing, because they're effectively being used as a tool to surveil and control the money. And that is effectively breaking down what money is. Money is meant to be free. Money is just information. It's a global ledger that doesn't really exist anywhere, right? If you break down money at a very fundamental level, it's just people exchanging value and energy with one another. But we have to anchor it to some mechanism in the real world. And historically, that's been seashells and metal coins, and then paper bills, and then digital numbers, right? But you're just anchoring that human interaction and human energy into some other medium that you're able to track. But the banks have been tasked de facto with the mission of managing that. And it's not a really good mission, because they're businesses, they're trying to make money somehow. And that makes them do riskier and riskier things. And the cost to onboard people into that system is increasing too. So eventually banks will go away unless money is restored. And the only way to restore money is to adopt Bitcoin. So they have to make a choice at some point. And I'm not sure they'll be able to do that, but they'll need to adopt Bitcoin with open arms and become Bitcoin banks and offer new services. But at the same time, you'll need the legacy infrastructure that is pushing them to surveil the money to give up and just accept Bitcoin as money, and you can't monitor and control it anymore. So there's a lot of things that have to play out in the end. But in the interim right now, we are seeing banks in the world becoming more accepting of Bitcoin, like in Hong Kong, where the mandate is onboard these and bring them in as customers. And I think that has to do with a realization that the old system is not working, because Hong Kong is one of those jurisdictions. It was very open maybe 10 years ago, but they've been slowly tightening up and becoming more and more restrictive on account opening and transactions. Like if you send a wire to pay a vendor, you might get a phone call or a question asking you what you're doing with that money, right? And that has to do, I think, largely with the Chinese capital controls and attempts to enforce those capital controls through those banks. But at the same time, people are leaving Hong Kong because of those restrictions, and it's not as hot of a jurisdiction to domicile your business, invest money in, and keep your money in. So I think a few years back, there's a massive exodus of Hong Kong companies and people that have been flooding to Singapore, which has been more receptive and more welcoming of capital. And I believe that whoever is running Hong Kong now is understanding that Hong Kong will not be a financial center of the world if they deny money from being money. And this is why that's happening. So it's an interesting battle right now. It's a tug of war, and we'll see where it goes. But ultimately, banks have to adapt, and they have to embrace Bitcoin if they want to exist in some form or other.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're kind of lining that out, right? Where it's almost like businesses kind of controlling, not I guess controlling in a full sense, but going where the incentives lie. And like we've kind of seen that, it seems like over time, especially like here in the US, right? I mean, we've seen like a massive amounts of migration over the past couple of years from, states like New York, California, and other things to like Texas and, Florida. But it seems like that's kind of happening globally with businesses as well. Would you kind of, I guess, attest to that as well, where it's like, if you're going to make things difficult for a certain company or, a certain industry that obviously is exploding, right, in growth, that these companies are going to start to shift from maybe either it's Hong Kong to Singapore, or maybe it's even to something like El Salvador or some other country like that.
I mean, people are going to make decisions that make sense. Companies are going to make decisions that make sense. So you have to align your incentives with reality of the world. You might want to surveil money for various reasons, but at the end of the day, if you do that, you're degrading what money is, and you're turning it into some bastardized version of itself. And when you compare that to something pristine, immutable, and permissionless like Bitcoin, there is just no comparison. So they have to do something. Either they're going to adapt or they're going to die.
I love that. I love that. All right. Well, before we leave, I want to ask you about the ETF filings. I, alluded to it a little bit earlier, but it seems like everybody and their mother now in the United States is starting to file for a Bitcoin ETF, whether it's spot or some other way, shape, or form. But yeah, I'll just leave it right there. Like, what do you think, I guess, of these big dogs kind of trying to get in to this Bitcoin space now? I mean, it seems like a lot of other countries, Canada and like a lot of, a few others have had, spot ETFs for a while, but the US has always been lagging behind. So, one, why do you think the US is lagging behind? And I guess what's your overall opinion on, these big companies now starting to get in and starting to try to, I guess, reap some of the profits of like maybe a Bitcoin ETF?
Well, I think it has to do partially with the SEC crackdown, which brought clarity that Bitcoin is okay. So Michael Saylor said this, I think at a conference, I think in the Prague conference. Yeah, I think in Prague. But he was saying, if you read between the lines, all politicians talking about Bitcoin in Congress and all the regulatory actions from the SEC, it's saying that Bitcoin is okay. Everything else is a security or it's a scam or whatever, but Bitcoin is okay. Bitcoin is fine. So what the SEC is doing is paving the way for BlackRock and Fidelity and everyone else to really understand that Bitcoin is okay, and you can build a business and financial products around Bitcoin. And that is exactly what they're doing. That clarity now, I think, is driving BlackRock to move ahead. Maybe they've been planning for a long time, and maybe they've been trying to iron out their filing so it's bulletproof. But I would say the timing is either coincidental or perfect, but it's a good time for them to come in. And I think the impact on the market is massive because contenders like BlackRock, like Fidelity, there's two things here. One is they signal that Bitcoin is serious and this is institutional grade investment material. And this is why they're moving in. Like BlackRock typically doesn't do, random things. They do serious things. The other part of it is that they open the door for a lot of capital to come into Bitcoin. So a lot of institutional investors, funds, pensions, whatever, they have to run by their current mandates, and they can't hold Bitcoin themselves, or maybe not even with a custodian, but they can do it with a spot ETF. So that is going to open the door for possibly $10 billion of capital to come in pretty much instantly when they're approved. And that's probably going to have a massive impact on Bitcoin. But it's two things here. It's a double whammy. One is you have BlackRock saying this is an institutional grade asset. Bitcoin is an institutional grade asset. And then you have the floodgates open for all of this capital to come in.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the floodgates opening would be, great for potentially the price action and other things like that. But the one worry that I do have about this is like, maybe the issuance of paper Bitcoin, because obviously the SEC is starting to go through some of their regulations and other things like that. But it seems like, in the past few years, we've had, obviously, we named the FTX and kind of the other scandals that went down. How would this be, I guess, somewhat different in a sense where now that this is a spot ETF and that is kind of, I guess, the new avenue, how would, I guess, the SEC be able to, I guess, verify that, BlackRock, Fidelity, some of these other big players are not just holding paper Bitcoin?
Well, it's much harder to fudge the books as an institution like BlackRock than it is for an FTX. So I watched a podcast yesterday, or a clip. I think it was Greg Foss, and I forgot the name of the guy, but he did the EBIT ETF in Canada, and he was saying that BlackRock has a surveillance agreement with Coinbase, which should fulfill that regulatory requirement that they have surveillance over a large market. And they feed that into some mechanism. I can't explain it as well as he did, but it feeds into a NASDAQ monitoring system for surveillance. So his theory is that BlackRock has all of this mechanism figured out, and that should satisfy the SEC's requirement for approving that. So I think it's possible that BlackRock could be the first.
Nice. Yeah, that's great stuff. And it seems like it's kind of moving that way, but your time is valuable and you've been very generous to come on the podcast. So I really appreciate you coming on. So for those wondering where they can follow along to see like what you've got going on, maybe some updates or other things like that, where's the best place they can find you? And yeah, thanks so much.
I'm on Twitter and on Nostr. You can just search for Excellion, EXCELLION. And yeah, I'm online and available.
Yeah, great stuff. So Samson, thanks so much for coming on. Everybody go follow him on Twitter. Follow Jan3 as well. What's that handle? Is it just Jan3?
It's Jan3com.
Yeah, follow Jan3com to see all the stuff that they've got going on. So great stuff. And yeah, Samson, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. It's been fun.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this great episode. If you enjoyed this one and you want some more content, click on the link right here and check out my latest interview with Tom Luongo. We get into it all. If you've known Tom, he's a wild one, so stay tuned. And if you found some value in this podcast, please smash that like button, hit that subscribe button so you get notified of the next videos. All right, I'll catch you at the next one.